Recognizing the member for Chilliwack, Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to speak in support of Bill 6, the Accessible British Columbia Act. The introduction of this accessibility legislation is a significant step forward in building a barrier-free BC. I just wanted to start my remarks by acknowledging some of the incredible staff team I've had the privilege of working with for the past couple of months. Sam Turcott has been leading our efforts as the executive lead in the Accessibility Secretariat. His leadership and support in getting the Minister and I up to speed on this critical work has been greatly appreciated. Chrissy Spinoza, our Director of Stakeholder Relations, and Guillaume Dufresne, our Director of Policy, have been cornerstones in establishing the positive work culture and incredible performance of the Secretariat. And finally, Tess Hawkins, Policy Analyst, Shaylin Williams, Policy Analyst, Bryn Langford, Policy Analyst, Amanda Arnett, Administrative Assistant, and Denise Claire Smith, Assistant to the Executive Lead. This small but mighty team of 8 staff have made this legislation possible, and I'm looking forward to working with them all in the years ahead as we work to get these standards right. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the evolution of disability in BC. All barriers start as ideas, and it's important to recognize where the barriers we face today originated from. Historically, policies and practices have been designed to exclude and in some cases eradicate disabled people. BC opened its first asylum in 1872, rebranded as the Provincial Asylum for the Insane in 1878, which would later be renamed Woodlands School in 1950, and again to just Woodlands in 1974. This institution was open for over a century, having closed in 1996. Woodlands was supposed to provide care for children and adults with developmental disabilities and mental illness. But we know the legacy of the institution, one that was riddled with systemic abuse. In 2002, former provincial ombudsperson Dulcie McCallum determined that there had been widespread sexual, physical, and psychological abuse of Woodlands residents. However, the provincial government at the time did not accept the findings of the McCallum's report. In August 2002, a class action lawsuit was put forward by former Woodlands residents. After it was certified, the province sought and won a ruling at the BC Court of Appeal to exclude former students who lived at Woodlands prior to August 1st, 1974. This decision was applied to the settlement agreement eventually reached in 2009 and approved in 2010, establishing a compensation claims process. In 2018, the Premier and Minister of Health announced that former residents of Woodlands who attended the school before August 1st, 1974 would finally receive compensation for systemic abuse suffered at the provincial institution. At the time, the Health Minister had this to say: "I want to recognize the Woodlands survivors, many who I met on this issue more than a decade ago. They persisted against prejudice and mistreatment from the province for decades, even after the school shut its doors and a settlement agreement was reached with some former residents. Today's announcement brings some small measure of justice for them, and I am very proud of the Premier and many advocates for making it happen." Now, we've come a long way since eugenics, forced sterilization, and institutionalization, but we must recognize the history that has shaped the conversation about people with disabilities. There are over 926,000 British Columbians over the age of 15 that have a disability. This makes up nearly 25% of the population. In BC, a higher proportion of women, 26.5%, report living with a disability. Only 22.9% of men report living with a disability. Disability prevalence is also much higher among Indigenous people across Canada. 36% of Indigenous women and 26% of Indigenous men report having a disability. These figures are based on Stats Canada's 2017 numbers and exclude Indigenous people living on reserve. We know that the percentage of people reporting a disability increases with age, and that people with disabilities are diverse in terms of their experiences, backgrounds, and needs. Disability types vary. The highest proportion of disability type are related to pain, but we know people also face disabilities impacting their flexibility, mobility, mental health, seeing, hearing, dexterity, learning, memory, developmental, and more. The way in which people experience their disability also varies greatly. Some disabilities are continuous while others are progressive. Some are recurrent and others are fluctuating. According to a survey conducted by Stats Canada in 2017, 3 in 5 Canadians with disabilities do not fit the conventional view of disability as continuous and unchanging. And we also know the severity of disabilities also varies greatly. These statistics show the sheer diversity in how disability is experienced. It's therefore important to remember as we move ahead with the development of accessibility standards, equity, and the equal access to opportunities will be critically important for consideration. I'm sure all members in this House have noticed that I use a wheelchair. What some members may not know, however, is that I've been using a wheelchair for over 2 decades as a result of a serious workplace accident. Despite using a wheelchair for many years, my knowledge of disability up until quite recently was relatively limited. I was aware of the barriers I encounter on a regular basis, whether that's the need to circle the exterior of a venue more than once to assess if there's an accessible entrance and corresponding parking spaces, or once inside trying to identify where the closest accessible washroom is, or figure out if the venue itself has appropriate elevators or lifts to navigate between floors. Because of the inaccessible environments that surround us, there have been many times where I've had to rely on the help of those around me. Whether it's my aging father doing the Herculean task of lifting his son up a set of stairs, and I haven't been getting lighter, Mr. Speaker, I'll just say that, or my friends trying to come up with innovative ways for us to get around downtown Vancouver as a result of accessible taxis not being available, or my staff and caucus colleagues doing everything they can to ensure that I'm able to effectively navigate this legislature that I have the privilege of speaking from today. Barriers to being a wheelchair user exist all around us, but these types of physical barriers represent only a subsection of the barriers people with disabilities face in their everyday life. In many ways, as a white cisgendered male in a wheelchair, I am what many think of when they hear the words disability or disabled. And up until recently, I wasn't actively considering all of the barriers people with disabilities experience. Since becoming the Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility, I've had the opportunity to meet with many individuals and groups who have shared information about the barriers they face and the opportunities we have with this legislation before us today to get this right for all British Columbians. I'm grateful for these conversations, and I'm committed to using my role and my privilege to advocate on behalf of all persons with disabilities. In 2018, the Canadian Human Rights Commission noted disability as the ground of discrimination in 52% of its cases, an increase of 33% since 2008. The fact is, we live in a world that is primarily shaped by people without disabilities. This unfortunately leads to increased barriers, stigma, and discrimination for those living with a disability. One of the goals of this legislation is to proactively identify and remove barriers in every sector of society. One of the biggest types of barriers we face are in fact attitudinal. There is simply a lack of knowledge surrounding disabilities. I recognize that as a society we have a lot of work to do when it comes to education. And I will be the first to acknowledge that despite having a disability myself, I by no means consider myself an expert. I too have more learning to do, and am committed to doing it. But too often there is a belief that having a disability means you're different. And when we equate difference with negative or undesirable conditions, we reduce people with differences as lesser citizens. This lesser than mentality supports the illusion that people without disabilities are normal or whole, and that those with disabilities are not. But when we recognize the sheer diversity of humanity and that bodies of all forms, including bodies with impairments, make up this humanity, we begin to see people for who they are. People with disabilities, like all other people, are people full of possibilities and potential. We can set aside the outdated notions that we are different and instead come together as people committed to supporting one another regardless of ability. This milestone would not have been possible without the advocacy and support from former Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, Shane Simpson. I know Shane personally, and his contributions to this province through the work of this ministry is undeniable. I feel incredibly lucky to now have the opportunity to support this work in my capacity as BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Accessibility. In fall 2019, Shane and our amazing staff in the Accessibility Secretariat led an extensive consultation and engagement process which garnered feedback from nearly 7,000 British Columbians. This work included 10 regional community meetings around the province in Vancouver, Victoria, Surrey, Fort St. John, Prince George, Kamloops, Nelson, Terrace, and Comox. There's also a virtual town hall. Seems odd to think that although only 18 months ago it was a new technology back then, I think we'll be doing more virtual town halls in the future, Mr. Speaker. There were 75 independent community conversations, specific engagement session for Indigenous peoples hosted by Not-Samat Tribal Council, and an online questionnaire that garnered significant feedback. Advocates and organizations from across the province provided detailed submissions on how they would like to see this legislation shaped, which has resulted in the comprehensive bill we now have before us. The engagement process was based on the document Framework for Accessibility Legislation, and a guiding principle in the document and throughout the consultation was nothing about us without us. Fortunately, people with disabilities have and will continue to play a leading role in this legislation. And it's with their continued input that we'll be able to ensure all British Columbians can participate fully in their communities. One group that has been formative in the development of this legislation has been the Accessibility Legislation and COVID-19 Advisory Committee. The Accessibility Legislation and COVID-19 Advisory Committee is comprised of leaders from every corner of our province, and their insight has helped shape the bill before us today. Membership comprises of people with disabilities and representatives of disability organizations and representatives from the BC Chamber of Commerce, BC Federation of Labour, and Union of BC Municipalities. Their continued advice have led us to putting forward a bit better bill, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with these individuals during the development of subsequent accessibility standards and regulations. Current members of the committee include Chris McBride from the BC Spinal Cord Injury, Sarah McRae from Prince George Brain Injured Group, Albert Rule, formerly of Canadian Council of the Blind, Forrest Smith, the Greater Vancouver Association of the Deaf, Christopher Sutton, Wavefront Center for Communication Accessibility, Lois Turner from Communication Assistance for Youth and Adults, Carla Verscher from Inclusion BC, Tanya Veronius from the MS Society, Neil Belanger from British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disability Society, Helene Boyd from Disability Alliance BC, Cheryl Burns from the BC Federation of Labour, Mary Lynn Chang from Union of BC Municipalities, Ross Chilton from Community Living BC, Doremi Ailing from Rick Hansen Foundation, Johnny Morris from the Canadian Mental Health Association of BC, Sheila Pither from Council of Senior Citizens Organizations of BC, Rob Sleeth, Access for Sight Impaired Consumers, and Timothy Stainton, UBC Center for Inclusion and Citizenship. I was thrilled that they were able to virtually join us for the event celebrating the introduction of this landmark legislation. Another advocate who joined us at the announcement was Sarah Chung, a board member of Disability Alliance BC. I just wanted to share some of Sarah's words that really resonated with me. I have a physical disability, and my parents were told that I would never go to school or gain meaningful employment. However, I have 2 undergraduate degrees from the University of British Columbia and work part-time as a lab manager and volunteer my time on various disability advisory committees. Despite enduring countless barriers, I have learned to become an advocate for myself and those with disabilities who do not have a voice. I've experienced barriers with regards to healthcare, education, employment, transportation, housing, and community participation, but refuse to let my disability define what I can accomplish. Some examples of significant barriers I've encountered over the years are: 1, attitudinal biases from those in authority, healthcare professionals and employers; 2, the lack of financial support for basic physical and medical needs; 3, challenges with accessing specialized healthcare; 4, struggles to obtaining meaningful employment; and 5, the lack of subsidized accessible housing. Creating accessibility legislation would remove systemic barriers and ensure that all individuals, regardless of their ability, can have equal opportunities to participate and be included in society. I'm extremely excited to see how the BC government will make BC more accessible and be a leader in accessibility so people with disabilities can continue to live, work, and thrive. Sarah's words outline many of the areas that our government is committed to improving through the adoption of this legislation. And as we move ahead in this process, we'll need the perspectives of advocates like Sarah to help ensure we get this process right. Also at the announcement, we have Lisa Beecroft, owner of a small business in Port Moody and co-chair of the President's Group. President's Group is a group of business leaders who are committed to creating inclusive and accessible workplaces, and members of the President's Group, also known as the Accessible Employers, are aware of the many advantages of having a diverse and inclusive workforce. They've found that hiring inclusively can improve company culture and increase employee retention. They've also found that 90% of consumers prefer companies that employ people with disabilities. The President's Group currently has 25 members, ranging from local small businesses like Tacofino and Save on Meats to large corporations like YVR, the Port of Vancouver, and Van City Credit Union. Current membership of the President's Group includes Lisa Beecroft, who's the owner and co-chair of the group. She owns Gabby and Jules Handmade Pies and Baked Goodness. Daniel Bragg, President Bilo Foods. Tom Conway, CEO Small Business BC. Devin Curry, CEO Maple Communications. Agnes Garba, Chief Operation Officer, SAP Labs. Eric Hopkins, President and CEO of BCAA. Nicholas Jimenez, President and CEO, Insurance Corporation of British Columbia. Ash McLeod, Managing Director and Partner at Save on Meats. Kevin Millsap, Executive Director, the British Columbia Libraries Cooperative. Santa Ono, President and Vice Chancellor, the University of British Columbia. Chris O'Reilly, President and CEO, BC Hydro. Walter Pela, Managing Partner, Greater Vancouver Area KPMG. Aaron Pinkerton, President and CEO of BC Transit. Robin Sylvester, President and CEO, Port of Vancouver. Ryan Spong, co-owner of Tacofino. Kirsten Sutton, Chief Technology and Information Officer with Van City. Caroline Toes, Chief Operating Officer, HSBC. Marilyn Teifting, Senior Vice President and CCO of TELUS International. Tamara Vrooman, President and CEO, ex-co-chair, Vancouver Airport Authority. She's the ex-co-chair of the President's Group. Marshall Walden, President and CEO, Destination Canada. Sarah White, COO and co-founder of Fairware. Sam Whitaker, Assurance Market Leader West, Ernst & Young. And Russell Zernhelt, Executive Vice President of Ledcor Construction. That was a lot of names, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading them because I think it's very important that these people are recognized for their work on this legislation. President's Group have set, in their own words, a big, hairy, audacious goal that by 2030, 51,000 more people with disabilities in British Columbia have appropriate employment that fulfills their work potential and the needs of our labor market. Many people assume that people with disabilities are unable to work as a result of their impairments, but we know this is only part of the reason that many are unable to find work. Discrimination, negative perceptions, and a lack of workplace accommodations are all conditions preventing the employment of people with disabilities. But more than that, we know accessible transportation options, information, and communications are all important components to ensure workers are set up for success. Fortunately, with leading employers like SAP Labs committed to employment equity, we're heading in the right direction. We know that an employer's willingness to accommodate differences, particularly through workplace accommodations, can make all the difference in building an inclusive workforce. During this pandemic, we've seen how workplaces have been able to adapt to keep people safe. Many of these workplace adaptations, whether they be changes to workstations, flexible work hours, or the addition of new technology, are the types of accommodations that would directly benefit people with disabilities. A change as small as incorporating a scent-free workplace or limiting noise within the office can make all the difference. I do want to acknowledge that our goal with this legislation is accessibility. Employment will be an outcome for some, and that's fantastic, but we recognize there are many different ways for people with disabilities to contribute and participate in society. That's why employment is only one of the proposed areas for standard development. In order for us to make life better for people with disabilities, our government is committed to breaking down these barriers. We are not the first government to put forward comprehensive accessibility legislation, but I believe our government has learned from the experiences of other jurisdictions and is putting forward a better bill as a result. Bill 6 defines disability as an inability to participate fully and equally in society as a result of the interaction of an impairment and a barrier. Disabilities can be physical, sensory, mental, intellectual, or cognitive, and can be temporary, episodic, or permanent. We've provided a broad definition of disability and have also defined barrier and impairment. As I mentioned earlier, a large part of this work will be focused on increasing awareness and supporting a culture change. This work will begin with government taking the lead by developing a comprehensive accessibility plan outlining opportunity across all ministries to make our operations more accessible and inclusive to people of all abilities. This will be important work that will require the participation of our professional public service, and in time, this legislation will also identify organizations that need to chart forward similar plans. This legislation also makes it clear that the minister has the responsibility to promote accessibility through initiatives like Accessibility Week, which will be happening this year from May 30th to June 5th. This fourth annual Accessibility Week is an opportunity to celebrate the valuable contributions of British Columbians with disabilities and to recognize the efforts of individuals, communities, and workplaces that are actively working to remove barriers to accessibility and inclusion. I recognize that people with disabilities need to have ownership over this legislation. This legislation will call on the formation of a new Provincial Accessibility Committee, which will advise the Minister on the development of new accessibility standards and regulations. As I mentioned earlier, a guiding principle of our consultations and of the legislation is nothing about us without us, and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. When Bill 6 receives royal assent, government's first action is to appoint a Provincial Accessibility Committee, and at least half the members must be people with disability or a representative of a disability organization. Membership must also reflect the diversity of British Columbians, including having Indigenous representation on the committee. This committee will advise the minister on the development of accessibility standards and regulations. And we know our province is incredibly diverse and that one single committee may not reflect our province perfectly. That's why this legislation also calls for the development of technical committees to support the standard development process. Technical committees comprising of experts in their field will assist us in ensuring that we get this right. I also want to acknowledge that this bill will call for the creation of a new online feedback mechanism to ensure all British Columbians can regularly comment and engage with government directly on this legislation. Staff are currently working on developing the online tool, and I'm looking forward to its launch. This feedback tool is aimed at being complementary to the work I'll be doing across the province, ensuring that the voices of British Columbians are heard and understood. Bill 6 lays out the foundation to develop accessibility standards. The bill lists 8 potential areas for standards development: employment, delivery of services, the built environment, information and communications, transportation, health, education, and procurement. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. We'll be looking to the Provincial Accessibility Committee to provide its advice and input into determining which standards should be developed first. And as I mentioned, technical committees will be formed to provide advice on the development of a particular standard. My role in this process will be focusing on engaging British Columbians in every corner of the province to ensure our legislation is effective and well understood. As we continue to get closer to a post-COVID-19 world, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to meet British Columbians in person to get a better understanding of how these accessibility standards will work best for them. We know this process will require culture change, and while as a society we've made progress in some areas, there is still more to do. I do want to acknowledge the novelty of this legislation. In this chamber, we have fierce debates about how we want to shape our province. But on the issue of accessibility, one of clear human rights, it's fantastic to see the House stand in unison on the need to move this important work forward. This work is not partisan. And this work won't be completed by a single government alone. The truth is, we will continually need to take steps to address barriers as they arise. And this legislation sets out the framework for us to do this. I do want to also acknowledge the words of my colleague from Surrey South. We've exchanged our thoughts on accessibility in the past in this House, and it's a delight to hear the excitement and commitment to getting this work done from the opposition benches. The member recently spoke in this House on the need to address the gaps in accessible parking. I couldn't agree more. The member has also spoken about the barriers faced in the legislature. In my couple of visits here, I've experienced them myself, and the member has spoken about how this work will be transformative in ensuring all British Columbians have an equal opportunity to participate in this province. This, my friends, is a goal that we all share, and one that I'm delighted we are united in working towards. In conclusion, I just want to circle back to an earlier statistic I shared regarding the prevalence of disability in our province. Nearly 1 in 4 British Columbians over the age of 15 in BC identify as having a disability. As individuals are self-identifying, there's a good chance this number should in fact be higher. But beyond that, we know that as our population ages, the prevalence of disability will increase. And whether it's genetics or in cases like mine, an accident, more and more British Columbians will find themselves living with a disability. Like I've mentioned, I'm supported by an amazing partner, familial network, and friends. And the barriers I face are felt by those around me. Passing this legislation demonstrates that this government and truly all members of this House are committed to moving towards a barrier-free BC. One where every British Columbian, regardless of ability, are fully included in our incredible communities. The current barriers people with disabilities face are not because of their personal problems, but rather inadequate policy and design that hasn't kept them in mind. By placing the needs of people with disabilities at the forefront of our work, through this legislation, we can lift the burden off of advocates and instead work with them as full and equal members of society. Whether it's in our workplaces, schools, or transportation systems, in the way that we communicate or deliver services, or the way in which we receive health care or navigate our built environment. This legislation provides us with the path to a barrier-free BC. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude my remarks, and I look forward to hearing words of support from colleagues on all sides of the House.